In this lesson, what we're going to do is talk about some of the common scenarios that you're going to run into when you're working with files. You've learned now how to open, close, read, and write to them, to and from them. Let's go over some of these common examples for you. These common scenarios are going to be file statistics, such as calculating the file size, determining the number of words that are in a file, and then also the number of lines that might be in that file. You might want to search for something inside of a file. We're going to go over that. And then how to append data to a file. Maybe you want to add some data you've already written to that. A logging example is a really good example for that, where you want to append data entries to the bottom of that file. And then finally, we're going to go over how to work with two files at the same time. Maybe there's a situation where you want to read a file and then immediately write to another file while reading it, depending on what the situation is. We're going to go over that in this lesson today. First up, what we want to do is look at some file statistics, or how to calculate some file statistics. There's lots of statistics out there that you could try to calculate, but the most common that I've come into is these kind of three things. You want to know what a file size is. You want to know how many number of words there might be in there. And then finally, you might want to know the number of lines that might be in a file. So let's go over these three different scenarios that we have here. So first off, let's get about getting the file size. Getting the file size actually has nothing to do with opening the file. You can do it without doing that at all. And the way you do it is you can use it one of two ways. You can use OS, the OS package, and you do os.path.getSize and then pass in the file path. Or you can do the pathlib, which is you create your path using your pathlib.path, and then you do path.stat and then size right there. So that's how you get that statistic that's in there. Really easy. Now remember, the pathlib is only available in Python 3.4 and beyond. Hopefully that's not an issue for you, but if that is, then you can at least use the os.path to be able to get that running in there for you. Next up, we're going to talk about getting the number of words in a file. Now, defining what a word is kind of difficult and hard to determine. So in my case, I'm going to say a word is any collection of characters separated by a space. Okay. And so what I'm going to do is I want to iterate through my file and then determine which ones have been separated by kind of a space that's in there. Now, that may not be the greatest way to define this, but that's just the way that I decided to define this in this case. So what I've done here is I'm going to iterate over my file, which is our little Darth Plagueis tragedy text file that's in there. I'm going to iterate through each line of that file, and then I'm going to calculate the number of words by setting this variable to 0, and then every line I split it up. Now you remember that when we do split, it'll actually split that line up into a list based off of the delimiter that we passed in there, and the default delimiter is a string. So let's look at this inside of our Visual Studio Code here. So I'm going to pull up actually this file and pass this guy over here, and then I'm going to tell this guy to word wrap so that we can kind of see what's going on here. So I've got 5 lines in here, and then in the first line I've got this statement, in the third line I've got this statement, and in the 5th line I have a really long statement. So let's count how many words there are in here. Now first I need to import pathlib into here. I'm passing in the file to my Darth tragedy size right here. And then what I'm going to do here is I'm going to actually do words is equal to line.split like this. And then I'm going to change this over to words just to kind of show you what this is. But I'm going to print out words to show you what that words looks like. And then finally at the end, I'm going to print the number of words that are in there. So let's clear out my console here and run this file and see what happens. So let's go through and see what got printed out. So you can see that each time it printed out a list of each of those words. So the split, because it's a space, is going to take this guy, remove that space, and create a word or a entry in the list for each one of these. You'll also notice that it didn't include whites, or it didn't include the new lines that were in there. So we would have potentially expected new lines. So when split works, it actually will remove the white space for you that's in there, including you see there's a trailing space right here that was in there. So how did that work? Well, it didn't add another item in here. There's not an empty string that's in there. It noticed that it has to be kind of characters in there. Now it did notice that this was just an empty line, so there was nothing in there. So the split of an empty string is just an empty list that's in there. So as you can see, we iterate through this. Let's actually iterate through this just one time to show you kind of what's going on. So here we got our path right here. We've opened our file. We've got our number of words equal to 0 right here, right? And then we're going to look at our words right here. In fact, let me do this. Num words and words here. So you can kind of see in here, I've moved kind of these guys into this watch right here, just so that we can kind of see what happens and what changes to things that are in here. So as we iterate over this. So I'm going to print the words, and then I'm going to increase our number of words. And there was 11 words in there. So now we're going to move into here. Our words is now nothing. There's nothing in there. That means that the length of that shouldn't change. And indeed, it did not. It still stayed 11. So now in our next one, we have the I thought not in there, right? So the length of that should be 3. So we should expect this to turn into 14. And indeed, it does. It turns into 14. And then finally, we have the next one, which is an empty list. And then finally, the last one, which is the whole set of the words that are in there. And we increase this, and now there was a lot of words in there. We're up to 134 or 138 number of words in there. And that's how that was calculated in there. So that's how you get the number of words inside of a file. Next up, let's talk about getting the number of lines in a file. This is actually really, really easy in Python. You just take the length of the file handler dot read lines. You'll remember that the read lines returns a list. And if you take the length of that list, then you have the number of lines that's in there. It's really, really easy. So here we have there are 5 lines in our path that we have printed out here. So, and that's exactly what we expected when we look at this. There are 5 lines in there. So those are common scenarios that you get when you want to try to do some statistics of a file, including find the file size, the number of words in a file, and then the number of lines in a file. Next up, what if we wanted to search for something inside of a file? Well, we can do that actually fairly easily. We can, if you'll remember back into our string methods, we had the find method. So when we iterate over a file, it is always going to return to us a string. That is always what's going to be when we open it up like this. Now, what we can do is use those string methods to our advantage. So we're going to use the find method. And the find method, if you'll remember, returns the location, the starting location of where that it's actually the starting location of where that that substring starts. Okay, so in this case, I have our Darth Plagueis, and I want to find where Jedi is, and then print out that line. So I want to check to see if Jedi is found in that line, and then if it is, then print out that line for me. So here I've got this Darth Plagueis tragedy, and then I print out the line that contains Jedi. that's in there. Now, what we're going to do is then one thing to realize is that things are case sensitive when you're working with find. So if you want to account for that, then what you're going to do is, and you run this. So if we run this on a lowercase Jedi, nothing is going to be returned in there. So if we want to change that, then what we got to do is use the dot lower method of the line. So we take the line, we take the lowercase value of it, and then we find Jedi in there. And then what I do is if the location is greater than or equal to 0, which means that it's not -1. If it's -1, it's not found in the line. Then what I do is I print out that actually location in there. So I print out the line, and then I print out a bunch of dashes and then a unique triangle character to point out to where this is where the start of our Jedi is. And you can see I searched for lowercase, but it was a lowercase string that triggered this. So that's how you search. You use the dot find within the within each of the lines. Now, if you want to read the entire file and do a dot find inside of that file, you can do that as well. So you would do a dot read and then do a dot find, and you would find that instance. And that's how you kind of search. So you basically just treat them like a string is basically what you do. And if you're going to work with the files, you can either iterate over each of the lines and search within each line, or you can bring in the entire file into memory and then search within that specific file as a string, as a very large string that's in there. Finally, let's talk about appending data to a file. Now, this is done by just simply passing in the A permission flag. So let's create a test data text file here. Okay, so I've got this test data. I just do a bunch of random numbers inside of here, right? And so I've got 10 random numbers that are in here, and they're all delimited by a bracket here, or a straight line here. And what if I wanted to append 5 more or 6 more or however many more numbers into that without having to do this? I wouldn't want to read this, copy that string, and then write it out again to it. I want to just append to it. Well, you can do that by just passing in the A. And you'll notice now we've got a few more lines in there, right? 5 more to be exact, into this line. And so that's how you would do that, is you just pass in the append. Now this is great for working with log files, but also remember that when you do the write, if you don't have a new line in there, it's just going to keep writing into that single line and keep going. And so that's how that works in there. Finally, what we want to do is learn how to work with 2 files at the same time. Now, this is kind of an interesting situation. In this kind of scenario, what I'm wanting to do is create our Darth stats, right? So what I want to know is how many times does the word "the" appear in each line? So I do that by opening first my Darth Plagueis tragedy.txt as a reader, and then I open the Darth stats.txt as a writer, as a writable file in there. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to iterate over each line. Now I'm using a new built-in function that you haven't learned about. It's enumerate. Enumerate, what it does is it iterates over a sequence, but it spits out a tuple. And that tuple is a number of iterations starting with 0 and then the value of what that sequence would be. So for example, let's take this in here, and I'm going to say for I in range of 100 to 110, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to say iter tuple and enumerate of this guy. So we're taking the range, which should be 100 to 109, and then we're saying create this tuple. And then what I'm going to do is print out this iter tuple to show you what exactly is getting done here. So if I do Python and Scratchpad here, you'll see I have a 0 and then 100 and then 1 and then 101. This is a great way to kind of get the number of iterations that you've gone through, or if you're iterating through a file, the line numbers, assuming that your line number starts with 0. If you wanted to start with 1, then you just add that. So let's do that. So let's say I and then val in that. So we're unpacking that tuple into this. And now we can do print I plus 1 and our val and show you. Let me do these on separate lines to show you that it is indeed not a tuple anymore. We're going to run this now, and you'll see we've got on line 1, 100, and then line 2, 101, and line 3, 102. Now, it's not really a line because I'm iterating over a range, but we could do that over a file handler, and that's exactly what we do here. So I'm enumerating over the file handler. I'm getting the line number by doing this, and then the actual line contents by passing in line here. My words are going to be line.lower.strip.split. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the lowercase of everything. I'm stripping all of the white space, or all of the trailing white space that's on there, so the new lines, and then I'm splitting up the string to see what is to split up each of the words in there. And so then once I do that, I'm going to find the number of entries is going to be the words.count. So words is going to be a list, and I can do the count of the number of things in there by that. So that's another new function for you, or new method. So let's say I've got a random list in here, and that's equal to 1 and 2 and 3. And then let's say a 2, and then another 2, and then a 3, and then a 1, and then a 1, and then a 1, like that. So what I can do now is I can print random list.count and pass in a value in there. So what are the number of times that I see 2 appear in this list? Well, I can randomly count. I can count this myself. 1, 2, 3. But let's see if Python can do that for us. And indeed, it does. It counts that in there. So that's what's happening here, as I'm taking the count of the number of times the appears in this. So I have the appears 2 times in line 1, it appears 0 times in line 2, 1 time in line 3, and then finally 0 times, 8 times in line 5. And that's how that works right there. So I'm taking that account. I could change this to, let's say, I, right? And we'll run this. I'm getting an invalid syntax here. And why is that? That's because I am running on the wrong kernel. So because I'm doing F strings. Let's get back to this. I've changed this from the, which is this right here, and now I'm going to change this to I. And actually, I need to change this here like that. And you'll see that I doesn't appear at all in there. Why is that? Because it's lower. So if I do this, now we can see I appears once in there. Let's change this to Jedi. See how many times Jedi appears. Jedi appears in line 5, just once in there. So that's what you can do in there. You can kind of see how often a word appears inside of there, and kind of print that in there. And you can go from one file to the next as you go through without having to creating a situation where you want to loop through something maybe twice in there. And so that's how you can kind of open that up. All right, in the next video, what we're going to do is go over some assignments of what you can do in class assignments and practice problems with regards to working with files and these common scenarios that you run into.